everyone. Thank you for joining us. I hope you had a great breakfast, and it was a phenomenal keynote, both with Ms. Johnson and also with Brooke Rollins. Still getting an encore standing ovation next door that I hear. But thank you for joining us. I know more will come in as they trickle out from the breakfast. But I want to welcome you. Again, my name is Rob Henneke. I'm the litigation director and general counsel here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thrilled about this panel discussion here, really in talking about a different way that the foundation and working with the great friends that we have with great leaders in this area is changing this country and fighting for a better future. I'd be remiss if I didn't introduce my assistants here today. My sons Michael and Jonathan. They're getting a lot more out of this morning than they would get out of school. So they wanted to come see Daddy work, and this is what we do. We're a think tank. We talk. But excited to have them with us. So just real quick, if you are an attorney, this panel is accredited for continuing legal education with the State Bar of Texas. There's a sign-up sheet in the back. If you're not an attorney, put your name down. That's fine. We'll turn it in. But please make sure that you get credit if you're a licensed attorney. So the name of the panel here today, I'm gonna preview this a little bit before I introduce our panelists and then start the discussion. But the name of the panel is Restoring the Rule of Law with EPA's Affordable Clean Energy Rule. And kind of in framing it where I exist with the foundation, in some ways our litigation center, Center for the American Future, exists through litigation as a watchdog to hold government accountable in the ways that it should stay in its lane. But it also is existing to recognize that where there's sound policy, when it serves the interests of the American people. And there's going to be a lot of success stories, I think, to share with you with what this administration is doing with the overall big picture, and also why it is so important, why it really matters when you get down to the family and the individual unit, why energy policy is critically important for all persons in this country. And I think in framing this discussion, why do we have environmental regulation? It seems to answer itself, but I think in a lot of ways you can define the positive as a contrast by explaining the negative. Certainly in this country we're blessed with some of the cleanest air and the cleanest water in the world, of any country in the world. And I think we take that for granted. But I want to frame this discussion by saying, let's take a minute and let's think about some other major cities in the world that don't exist in that way. Let's think about Mexico City, where at one point in time I read that living in Mexico City was the equivalent of smoking a full pack of cigarettes every single day, just from the air quality there. Look at the pictures that you see of some of the industrialized cities in China. Think about the capital of India, New Delhi, which was in 2018 rated by the World Health Organization as the worst for air quality of any city in the world. Compare that to the United States. Compare that to the beautiful day that we have outside here in Austin, Texas. Look at this as a success story where we enjoy a clean environment, and we can always make it work towards bettering that. But let's recognize, the success stories that we've had here and look at the contrasts as where, those less fortunate have to exist. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panel, and we'll start off with a discussion. Thrilled to have all three with us. And first of all, to my furthest right, pleased to introduce Mr. Derek Hawley. Derek is the president of Reaching America, which is an outreach organization developed to address complex social issues impacting African American communities today. He's been a contributor to the Huffington Post, the Daily Signal, and the host of Reaching America On Demand podcast series. Derek has over 20 years of experience and has earned many accolades working with Fortune 500 companies like PepsiCo, Volkswagen, Alberto, Culver, and Dodge, and his firm, Global Advertising First, executed several education and outreach campaigns for the United States Department of State, Census Bureau, Department of Housing and Urban Development, and many others. Next to him in the middle, my good friend Mike Nassy, who's a colleague of mine at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, where he is the director of our Life Powered initiative, and also a partner at Jackson Walker Law Firm, where he practices environmental and energy law and has been doing that for over 25 years. Mike, I don't know how you started when you were 5, but he's the past chair of the State Bar of Texas Environmental and Natural Resources Law Section, and has served as a guest lecturer and adjunct professor at the University of Texas Law School right here on campus. Mike's been recognized many times, received numerous awards, including the Law 360 Environmental Trailblazer Award for his leadership on energy policy initiatives and project development. Last, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce my friend and welcome her back to Texas. She is on mission work in Washington, D.C. But Ann, and this is really a huge honor for the foundation to have Ann here with us, given her time and the demands in her role as the acting assistant administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation at the Environmental Protection Agency. Ann served as the principal deputy assistant administrator for this office, and before that was EPA's Region 6 administrator for the area that includes Texas. But her career prior to that was one very distinguished here in Texas state government. She served as the general counsel for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which by itself is, I think, one of the state largest environmental regulatory agencies in the country. She works for a bigger one now. And also led the Texas General Land Office as the chief clerk and deputy land commissioner for GLO, and working closely with Commissioner George P. Bush. So would y'all help me in welcoming our panel today? Yeah, Ann, if I can start with you, one of the things that we've, just kind of in framing your opening remarks, but one of the things that we've learned in this administration is its commitment to returning the Environmental Protection Agency to its core values. And in that context, welcome, of course, but please just kind of share your thoughts with us and help us frame the discussion.
Sure. So one of the things that I think is absolutely and very vitally important and is not said often enough, and that we don't get to talk about often enough, and we do in these types of settings, but you don't hear it more widely broadcast, which is, the core mission, as we all know within EPA, is to protect human health and the environment by, ensuring clean air, clean water, safe use and remediation of our land. What we've been able to accomplish as a country, and in working incredibly closely with the states, and the notion of cooperative federalism, which was baked into all of this enabling legislation that authorizes us to do what we do from a regulatory standpoint, has seen and given birth to amazing environmental progress on all fronts over the past 50 years. EPA is actually enjoying its 50th anniversary this year, and the Clean Air Act is celebrating its 30th year since the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. We don't tout our success and our progress enough, and what has been done to date is absolutely amazing. And I can rattle off a couple of just basic stats for you. From 1970 to 2018, the combined emissions of the 6 criteria air pollutants regulated under the NAAQS have dropped by 74%. Our economy grew 275% at the same time. That's amazing. And the reason why I focus on statistics like that and what we've been able to accomplish is that is the type of progress, that is the type of ingenuity and innovation that states and the federal government and working with the private industry have really been able to drive. But in order for us to continue to see what are now really smaller incremental improvements, to be hitting those national ambient air quality standards, to be hitting other standards that the federal government sets that are, protective of human health and the environment within an adequate margin of safety. We need to make sure that we are focusing in on those core responsibilities. Over time, there's the issue of mission creep. Different administrations have different priorities. They want to try out new things. They want to pilot programs. You've got all kinds of things that go on, which is great. It's important, tools to use to drive that level of, innovation and engagement across the board. But quite frankly, I think what the previous EPA Administrator Pruitt and what the current administrator really support, and rightly so, is the back to basics principles. If we don't do as an EPA what we are authorized to do and what we are charged with doing at the most fundamental level, we're not really doing our job. And that's to make sure that we're helping protect human health and the environment, and looking at what we're doing across the board when it comes to criteria air pollutants, hazardous air pollutants, and focusing in on those missions that really do impact human lives on a day-to-day basis. And that's obviously not just in air. We rolled out the new WOTUS definition yesterday. If you compare where we had been from a drinking water system standpoint back in the 70s, I think we had 40% of U.S. drinking water systems were not in compliance and were not where they needed to be. Today we're at 92% healthy, safe drinking water standards and that are being met by municipal water systems across the U.S. That's what we need to be doing. We need to be ensuring that we are living up to our responsibility, those core principles to ensure, safe, clean air to breathe, safe, clean water to drink, and safe land to use. And that's really what we're all about in this administration, is making sure that if we do nothing else, that we live up to those responsibilities.
Thank you, Ann. And Mike, turning to you, can you kind of pull back then and give a bigger picture context of what Ann is talking about in terms of, where we stand?
Yeah, well, thanks. And first of all, it's an honor to be here. It's a big deal that Ann is here, so this is a pretty good draw. I have people call all the time. You think Ann can make a presentation? There isn't a single conference that gets held in the country that doesn't want her and given her position, so it's a great honor. Thank you for making the time. It's not easy to make that flight back and forth, and even when your home state is here on this end. So, I do think, it's a fundamental. I entered law school right after the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990. And so I went to law school, sadly, as geeky as this sounds, because I wanted to be an environmental lawyer. My parents, my brother, my father, my grandfather, all public health official 06 officers, So I had to basically make an excuse to be a lawyer. If I wasn't going to get into public health, I was going to be disowned by my family. So it was critically important to me. And I think, the scientific underpinning of the Clean Air Act, just to take that act, because it kind of leads into the topic of our conversation, is all about, what Ann talked about. It was passed, it was a compromise between states, authority and federal authority. Frankly, a model piece of legislation for the world when implemented consistent with its intent, right? And so I have this kind of geeky thing that I talk about all the time. And in law school, the reason I brought it up is there was a guy who was an Ann Richards appointee to the Public Utility Commission. His name was Karl Robb. He was an interesting guy. He was a JAG lawyer, so he was an Aggie, interestingly, but then grew a really long ponytail during law school, and I was a research assistant to him in the environmental law program at U of H. And then he got appointed, had to cut the ponytail off, and we had this debate. It wasn't much of a debate. He was a law professor, I was a researcher, but he basically said, the whole key to protecting the environment is we're going to have to figure out a way for, in the electricity sector, the externalities of pollution to be internalized into the rate scheme, because there is no economic incentive for people to clean up the air. It was like one of the most fundamental dilemmas of our country in the 70s and 80s, and the Clean Air Act was a seminal moment, and its amendments in 90 to try to drive that home. And my geeky law student answer was, hey, we're going to internalize those costs. We're going to implement this act. We're going to set standards that are protective of human health and the environment with a margin of safety. We're going to require technology to meet those standards. And because that technology will cost some facilities a lot of money, it'll be baked into their cost on the market. And he said that'll never happen, industry will fight it, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it was really pessimistic. Well, I happened to be in a speech with him, like a panel just like this last summer in Wyoming, and I hate to say this, but 27 years later, and I told you so, because that's what happened. The Clean Air Act has been fully implemented. The controls that have been installed across all technologies, whether it's the electricity sector, the steel sector, oil and gas, have brought us to a point where we have baked in the cost of pollution by solving the problem with technology. And so I always talk about this. I mean, I don't regret or refute the idea that we have a Clean Water Act or a Clean Air Act, but they really all should have been called SAFE. We have the Safe Drinking Water Act, right? And the reason I say that is actually a lesson that Kathleen Hartnett-White, who's in the back of the room, taught a long time ago when she was presiding over the second biggest environmental agency in the world, which is these acts are designed to make the air we breathe and the water we drink safe. Clean is a nice term, but it's not tethered to science. There's no scientific standard that can tell you what clean is. There is a scientific standard that can tell you what is safe. It's called toxicology. It's called epidemiology. It's called being able to prove that we're actually making material benefits. So it's really important because what's happened, frankly, sadly, is that the left has taken hold of and branded the term clean to be whatever it actually chooses that term to mean whenever it wants. When our Constitution, I hate to get really constitutional about this, but it really is fundamental. When we pass laws and we cede authority to the governments that we elect, we need to actually have a standard that tethers them, keeps them in their lane. Safety of our air, the sufficiency of our actions is critically important to that balance of power. So when we meet these national ambient air quality standards that Ann made reference to, the fact that we are in compliance across the country, with a couple of exceptions, primarily Southern California and Chicago, interesting that that's the case, we have basically achieved the goal. And from then on forth, you're probably wondering, why do I keep on hearing studies that say, what the Trump administration is going to do is going to kill 200,000 people a year? Because it's completely cooked. It's absolute junk science. There's a great paper that Dr. Brent Bennett and Kathleen Hartnett-White have co-authored, and it's on the Life Powered website. It's just recently been updated. It's work that Kathleen's been doing for years, but it's a robust discussion of the actual scientific reason why claiming benefits in actual dollars or lives saved below, when you start reducing emissions below that safe level, is not scientifically justifiable. But every single, well, to be clear, 99.9% of the benefits, save lives, save dollars, that these studies that the left claims are happening because of what the Trump administration is doing, all of those additional benefits are actually claiming benefits below the health standard. So the answer to that, Clean Air Act has an answer, right? You amend the health standard. If there's really a health impact, the health standard would be lowered to reflect that. Why did the Obama administration not do that? Because they knew they wouldn't win that lawsuit, because there is no science to defend it. It's so easy to put out a report that says 100,000 people are going to die. It is harder to actually put a standard that imposes costs on industry if you can't back it up with science. So that's one of the most fundamental things we do at Life Powered, is try to actually figure out how that complex subject can be better understood, okay? It's not easy. This is one framework to talk about it, but we talk about it all the time. I don't know if we have the video linked up to where we can play it. Do we have the video loaded? It's no big deal. Go to the lifepowered.org website. We need to talk anyway. We don't need to have a video. But, sadly, I have 3 teenagers. I know the next generation, and frankly, even my generation, doesn't read much anymore. And so we actually have videos that do a really good job of animating exactly what EPA has on their website. Their website's fantastic. You should Google it, EPA's progress reports. It's a fantastic source of information. And all we try to do at Life Powered is amplify so more people can see that. And I say this to crowds and students all over the country. This is something we should be proud of. And it's really important that we get it right. Ann alluded to this, because if we break it, then the people who distrust government aren't going to believe that environmental law can be successful. Okay? There are a few billion people in the world that desperately need a model that works. If we don't stay true to the model that did work, they won't know what to grasp. And this is so critical as we pivot into a discussion about ACE, because if you talk about carbon dioxide, it's a whole nother area to be talking about. But we're talking about pollutants we know kill people, right? And so what we've got to do is have the right system, rule of law based, science based, that proclaims the greatness of what we've achieved, but stops promising people that there is more to achieve in a really material, beneficial way scientifically, and that anything that a current administration does and shop to actually make sure EPA stays in its lane somehow is hurtful to people. When in fact, what it's doing, I'm sure Derek has a lot to say about this, is keeping EPA in its lane, making sure our air is safe, but those additional costs for going after phantom benefits are not imposed on the people in our society who frankly can't afford it. Because that is a really big drift. And whether it's my brother, my father, or my grandfather who were in the business of public health, making sure our health our public is healthy and it's affordable to live in a society that has healthy air, we've got to stay in that lane because we've got a chance to improve the lives of billions if we stay with our model.
Oh, very well said. Thank you, Mike. And first assignment of the panel, everyone go home and read the EPA website with your family tonight. Mike and I will be. I mean, yeah. Derek, let me move to you.
I don't know how I'll follow up after that right there.
I think it flows well, though, because I asked Mike to pull it out to the broadest sense. And I want to ask you to pull it in to the individual unit. And first of all, introduce the work that you do and how you fit in with this discussion,
Sure.
but also talk to us about this concept of energy poverty.
Got it. Okay.
And what are we talking about, and why does that matter with what we're talking about with the policy?
Sure. Energy poverty, and you'll see it's a handout in your chair from the Energy Poverty Project. But what energy poverty is, it exists when individuals or families can't afford basic heating and electric needs. Oftentimes these people, sometimes they spend upwards of 25 to 30% of their total income on their electric bill. And when that happens, it puts people in a very difficult situation, having to make some very tough choices. Literally, do I eat today or do I pay this electric bill? Do I get the prescription filled or do I pay my electric bill? How I got into this energy thing is that when I first graduated from college, I worked for Norfolk Southern as a brakeman. I was out on the railroad. My job and responsibility was loading coal ships down at the terminal in Norfolk, Virginia. And our responsibility was shipping this coal to countries around the world. So I've seen how our natural resources benefit other countries. And it's unfortunate that we here at home don't feel like our natural resources are good enough for us right here. And so I try to take and make sense of what Mike and Ann say to the consumer and constituents and talk to them about why these regulations don't make sense, how these regulations will impact you on a daily basis, how these regulations, some of these regulations, as I like to say, they are misleading and they offer false hope, and it's just impossible to put this out there, and it's impossible to achieve. And we go back to some of these plans, like some of these the left and liberal are putting out, some of these clean energy plans or these the new Green Deal. It's just unfortunate how it doesn't make sense, and there's no way that we can reach those goals. And I talk about the EPA. We talk about, and Ann and I were talking earlier, a lot of the things that she talks about, I try to take that information and get it out to the public through education and outreach, through the Energy Poverty Project and a lot of the events and a lot of the op-eds and things that I do, just to try to talk and put a different spin on this administration and what's going on with our energy and the EPA, because right now, if you listen to the media, you think we're all going to die in 12 years. And now, no, it's not even 12 years, it's now 9 years, because it started out at 10, and so we're already 1 year into this. So it's we've got 9 years we're going to die if we continue to use the natural resources we have in this country. So I think it's just important that they continue to do the research at the EPA, they get it to people like myself, and then we get it out to individuals like you about what's really taking place in this space.
Staying with you, a little bit out of order, but I want to carry this thread forward with you, Derek. And one thing to point out, certainly those of us who live here in Texas, This is the dead of winter outside. It's 60 degrees. But when you talk about the impact of energy on the poor, in a lot of parts of this country, if you look at the north, if you look at Chicago in February, if you look at, upper New York or whatnot, it's not just a choice between buying groceries or paying your electricity bill. You can't live without heat when it's 5 degrees below zero and it's not going to climb above freezing for the next 20 days or something like that. So I think there's a greater context. And what I wanted to stay with you on for a moment was two points. One, the left seems to respond in this with the criticism on energy poverty with, well, we'll just give subsidies. We'll just give subsidies then to offset that. I'd like to get your reaction, but also to talk about the fact that you can't avoid the cost of energy. And it's not just your electricity bill, it's more than that. So what are your thoughts?
When you start talking about subsidies, it just irritates me. Because these subsidies, they're not benefiting the individuals who need them the most. And we look at studies that talk about electric vehicles, EVs. There are studies out there that say that right now that 90% of the people who drive EVs all make over $100,000 a year. Well, most of those folks in Chicago, in these urban cities, they're not making $100,000 a year. And it's unfortunate they have to pay into these taxes for these subsidies for these individuals to benefit from the government. And so that's one of the issues that we talk about the most. And the thing about it is, the media, they'll spin it. Oh, the subsidies, we're going to do it. But they never talk about the individuals who are receiving these subsidies and the individuals who are not. And that's my job, to get out and try to get in front of this and talk to people. And once I start having these conversations with individuals about what's really, really taking place, it resonates with individuals. And I think we're having a lot of success right now when we get out in front of this issue to talk to people. And they realize that what the media is saying and what they're saying against our administration is not true.
Let me move a little bit, and in framing the topic of our panel for today, restoring the rule of law with EPA's Affordable Clean Energy ACE rule, I have to mention at least briefly what we are restoring from, or what the administration is restoring from, and that was the policy of the past administration of the Clean Power Plan. And you'll recall that this was the President Obama's follow through from the Paris summit. The Clean Power Plan represented the implementation of the promises that were made in Paris. And we're challenged by 26 states who sued over that regulation, including a huge coalition. The Texas Public Policy Foundation was part of that. Mike, would you start off in kind of framing the Clean Power Plan in terms of how it moved EPA away from its role established by Congress, so that we can kind of understand the context of what we are moving to with the ACE rule?
You bet. So staying with let me start with just an informational it was actually very impressive. You always need to give credit to your adversaries when they do something impressive. It was an unprecedented media blitz and social media campaign. Some have argued, including internal investigations, an inappropriate propaganda campaign by the prior administration to convince people of two things. One, that the Clean Power Plan was going to save lives. And they were actually making the same claim I've already addressed, which is somehow magically, even though we're not moving what is safe, we're going to claim that going below that line is somehow going to save literally millions of lives, okay? And they put a number to it. But they also participated in an extraordinary misdirection campaign where they'd say carbon pollution, and they would immediately talk about asthma. And here's how effective that campaign was. I hope I don't have to explain to anybody in this crowd, I know I don't have to tell these two folks, that carbon dioxide doesn't cause asthma, okay? All right, I'm emitting it. I might emit too much of it, some would say, and would probably agree with that. But the fact is that it is an essential component of our Earth, right? So the question of climate change we'll get to in a second, but it is not a health threat, right? Yet, here's best evidence I can tell you how successful they were. I was in a national panel discussion with a bunch of utility commissioners. It was NARUC, which is their national association. So we're talking about, in many cases appointed, in many cases elected, top-tier policymakers in the electricity sector. And the commissioner from the District of Columbia said in my panel, we have got to have renewable energy because this carbon is causing asthma.
Oh my goodness.
And I thought, because I was literally in the geekiest place in the world, NARUC, it's like a bunch of utility commissioners, it's even more geeky than Ann and I in the EPA, right? It is, I said, I had to have been a mistake. I said, well, let's clarify. Were you talking about the claims of reductions in pollutants that I would say are actually specious in their claim? No, carbon dioxide, the stuff that comes out of these power plants that is causing climate change and causing asthma. That's a successful campaign because there isn't a scientist, no matter what party they vote in, that would support that statement, right? So, but getting back to the kind of the heart and soul of it, the EPA knew they couldn't actually affect their policy goal. The policy goal was stop using fossil fuel in the power sector, force renewable energy. We can't pass a bill in Congress on cap and trade, even when they control both houses, by the way, right? So we're frustrated with our democracy, so we think we want to take some shortcuts. Let's just take this thing called the Clean Air Act and try to argue that this is a health issue. And that's what they did. And it's an amazing thing. And I show this slide we have been using and updating long before Life Powered existed, when we were in a national debate. In fact, I was in a debate with the head of the Harvard Law Program on NPR, and I kept over and over saying, listen, no matter what you say about climate change, if you take the tools that the international regulators and negotiators use to estimate what a benefit a reduction of a ton of carbon is, and you don't debate the linkages, okay? That is a very important conversation to have. We should always be, because science is supposed to be about this, challenging and asking how much connection is there between carbon dioxide and actual warming. Certainly the lack of connection to extreme weather events, that's a topic for another day. Accept the premise, which I don't, but just walk with me down this alternative universe. Accept the premise that CO2 is a major driver of anthropogenic climate change. These models do that. This is just about materiality. This is just about whether you really move the needle when you regulate an already clean economy in order to forward a policy goal of renewable energy. Again, environmental regulator, supposed to be protecting our health through safe air and water, now saying, we've done that job, but we're going to keep on throwing our hands up and saying we're still doing that job, but what we're really doing is forcing renewable energy onto the market. And here's the first thing we always talked about, which is, and we'll get back into what the statute says here before we finish, but this is a really important underpinning. And it's not that we should always be striving for a more efficient economy, but when we reduced, this won't happen, but if we literally eliminated carbon dioxide from all of our electricity generation, so that's not just coal, that's all natural gas, no oil backup, zero carbon, it's the black line on that bar graph. That's using the models that the other side generates and uses all the time.
Wait, Mike, that's not the red thing.
No,
That's
the
the
red
black line
line,
next. Okay.
the red swath is our entire economy. Imagine that, everybody, right? That means we have zero carbon in our entire economy. That means you don't drive the car you drive now, even if it's electric, because it has a carbon footprint, by the way, okay? It is zero carbon. So that's not to say we shouldn't have conversations about how to make things efficient, what technologies might happen. That just proves the point, and it's a busy graph, but the numbers are on the bottom chart. The rest of the world is where this game is being played, okay? So what I just told people in Indiana yesterday, I'll tell them on Kansas on Tuesday. The world doesn't need windmills in Texas, Indiana, and Kansas. It does nothing for them, even if you think this is a calamity that's happening. Technology is what drives things. I skipped over this slide, but this is really important. Brent Bennett did this, and I've worked a lot with Brooke, and she loves this. If you want to know what made our air clean, do not accept the premise that it was renewable energy. The red line is renewable energy growth in the United States of America. All the other lines are the pollution levels for the pollutants we know kill people in the right dose and in the right concentration, right? So, and we color-coded it because it's fun to do that. It's not a political issue. When we're actually staying in the lane of the Clean Air Act, it works no matter what party's in power. And guess what? It wasn't renewable energy that did it. And so it is really that graph that frustrated the kind of policy goals of the left and the renewable energy advocates that wanted to basically misappropriate the best environmental statute in the history of the world, the Clean Air Act, and turn it upside down and say, you know what? We're going to say carbon dioxide is a pollutant that we can regulate and control the economy to do it. And we could rant all day long about the Clean Power Plan. We used to. Thankfully, we don't have to do that anymore because it's gone. Okay? You know who the first body that got to speak to the Clean Power Plan was? The Supreme Court of the United States. And they did something that has never been done in the history of our democracy. They stopped. They issued injunctive relief. They stayed the Clean Power Plan while it was being reviewed. That has never happened. And you know how hard it is to get a conservative justice to actually impose a judicial remedy like that? It's very hard. But that rule was so bad, so damaging, and so faulty that the Supreme Court did that. And so what we saw was when the Trump administration came in, they had a difficult choice. And this is kind of where Rob wanted to go. Okay? Do we just strike it down because it's bad? Or do we replace it? Okay? And it was a debate. Ann wasn't actually all at her current post. She was, I think, at the region when this debate was being waged. But this was a very legitimate question. And so this really starts to give where you get CLE credit in our presentation. We're going to drift into it now is, okay, so what does make sense? Do you replace it and why? And the heading, and I'll let Ann and Rob take us wherever they want on this. The heading is, we need to replace it because God forbid if we lose the White House again, we can't just hand the keys back to the people who misappropriated it last time. We've got to establish legitimate hurdles. We've tried to restore these things back together. So reinstating the rule is important. But Rob's going to point out, and Ann may allude to it too, and we'll talk some more about it, you got to do it smart, right? You got to not just stay in the lane, but you also can't concede that actually regulating carbon dioxide within the power sector is actually going to move the needle globally, because it's just not true.
So,
Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
yeah, Derek.
This slide right here, I was on a panel, television, a couple of weeks ago, and it's unfortunate, a lot of times when I'm talking to people, it's a black audience, and I have a difficult job at explaining what's really, really going on. And so, and a lot of people, as you said, Mike, they believe that CO2 is causing asthma in the black community. And I'm like, no. Most of the things that's causing asthma in the black community are in-home pollutants. And they didn't want to hear that. And Mike, I'm so glad you have this slide right here, because I need to get this right here so that I can talk to it.
It's a great video, too.
Right.
The team's put together
but it's unfortunate, again, and like you said, the EPA does all this great work, but a lot of it does not get out to the general public. And that's what we try to do, and I'm so glad that you put that slide up here, because it's awful, again, what the media puts out, that CO2 is causing asthma in the black community, which it couldn't be more false than that right there.
And it's important getting that message out. I know you and I spoke when we were planning on this about the National Black Chamber of Commerce study that was done on the Clean Power Plan. Mention just briefly what that found.
Well, it found, even Obama talked about that the Clean Power Plan would ultimately increase the cost of energy for low-income families and individuals. He said it himself, and studies have shown that anytime that you implement renewables, it will drive up the cost for low-income families, individuals, minorities, and rural communities.
I think that study found it would increase poverty among minorities by over 20% because of the Clean Power Plan. Now, Ann, let's look at the vision forward. Moving out of that, talking about the ACE rule, how do you see this as the case study that Mike alluded to on how to move EPA back to environmental policy?
So, great question. Thank you, Mike. You, I think, teed up very nicely kind of how we got to where we are and why ACE was the ultimate choice in terms of the replace option. You know, we repealed the Clean Power Plan, very importantly, replaced it with ACE, and with the ultimate goal, like Mike said, of we need something on the books, something that is legally and scientifically defensible, that will carry this torch forward. And by torch, I mean resetting the boundaries, resetting the appropriate respective roles of the state and federal regulating authorities to make sure that as we move forward, we account for what's practical, what's workable, and actually does what it says it's going to do. So traditionally under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, standards have been set based on measures that can be applied at the source. Well, Clean Power Plan got away from that pretty significantly. It departed from that source-specific approach and would have required, like Mike said, a huge shift, and not one authorized or mandated by Congress, in energy policy at the grid-wide level, from coal to gas and ultimately to renewables. So we believe in this administration that role, that those policies and those choices are really properly reserved for the states based on their unique priorities and their circumstances. And the reason for that being, if you're in a very energy-rich, dynamic, producing state like Texas, what we do and how fast our population is growing and how our grid is set up is fundamentally different, and understandably so, from the Northeast and from the West and from the Midwest. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just means that those different states and different parts of the country need to be given the flexibility to take the standards we set, and that when we define the best system of emission reductions for existing power plants, allow for the return of the focus to be placed on reducing emissions at the source, and then letting the states who know those individual sources best. Are folks looking to retire certain facilities? Do you have other state or federal rules that are in place that are driving, upgrades and improvements, or would otherwise impact the, larger operation and planning for those? You've got to let the states figure out what that looks like. We should be setting the goalposts, and the states need to figure out how to run the plays to get you down the line. It's not the EPA's job as an executive branch to be setting energy policy. That role properly resides with Congress, and under the prior administration went too far. We firmly believe in restoring that appropriate role back to EPA, respecting the roles between the federal and state governments, and allowing for that flexibility to make sure that states make those smart energy choices. I mean, again, depending upon where you are in the country, very different, diverse energy portfolios on a state-by-state basis based on what's coming online, where investments are being made. We should allow that to continue. We should empower the states to do that. That's going to allow for that innovation. That's going to allow for that flexibility. And quite frankly, that actually usually makes it a lot easier for the states to meet those standards a lot more quickly and in a financially and scientifically feasible and defensible way than if we tell them what plays to run down the line. Does not make sense. It does not work. And quite frankly, we've done such a good job over the years of picking a lot of the low-hanging fruit and working very closely with the energy sector as to how to make those environmental improvements. That's suddenly taking this very heavy-handed approach because there's a desire to move things as quickly as possible to renewables. Really undermined the public trust in the EPA, really undermined, I think, again, what is that fundamental role between the states and federal governments that was recognized in the Clean Air Act? And it was pushing things in a way that was fundamentally going to wind up being very detrimental to members of communities that are rural, low-income, minority, because you were picking a winner. That's not the EPA's job. We're not there to pick winners. We are here to protect human health and the environment, and states and industry and stakeholders can figure out how to best get there. It's not our job to pick those winners and losers, and the ACE seeks to restore that.
Well, right, and I mean, what might work in Texas doesn't work in Idaho. I think what you said recognizes that. Just carry that forward a little bit. Two questions as follow-ups to you. One, the 30-second elevator speech of what ACE does for our audience here, those watching online. And second, if you give a little peek behind the scenes, since you had such a leadership role with TCEQ and with EPA, how should that state partnership work, or how does that state partnership work now that y'all have recognized the role of states in environmental regulation?
Sure. Thank you. So real quick high level, the way that ACE works is that it defines the best system of emissions reduction, which we call BESR for short in the world of acronym soup in which I live. So you set BESR for existing power plants on site. So these are heat rate efficiency improvements, which again take the focus back to reducing emissions at the source within the fence line. ACE also implemented regulations to govern, again, those state and federal rules for ACE and all future 111D emission guidelines. This is very important because 111 does not just apply to the energy sector and to coal-fired power plants. So that's kind of at a very high level. Again, we set BESR, and then the states go back and they work with those individual sources and they go through their own regulatory system to figure out how to account for CO2 emissions, what type of upgrades, what type of technologies constitute BESR. We have 6 different candidate technologies that kind of meet that. How they're plugged in at a state-by-state level is pretty much up at the state's discretion. States get to look at planned retirements. That gets factored into their plans. And then we'll ultimately work with them to figure out, kind of how to move forward with a lot of discretion based on their information and based on their unique set of circumstances. So then to Rob's second point, which is how does that impact how we work with the states? To be perfectly frank with you, given, and I can say this having been on the other side of the table working for a state regulator during the previous administration, it was not uncommon for the EPA to say, we're going to tell you how to do this. We're going to tell the cow how it ate the cabbage. Make it work. Which we, as a former state employee, found really, that was not an easy message to swallow, because we're like, but we're different from Massachusetts. We're Texas. We're different from, Oklahoma. We're different from Montana. We're different from Washington. Why is that such a big deal? Why is that a problem? And it was certainly perceived among the states that were really being pushed outside of an area where they felt that they had the legal authority and the prerogative to make these changes where it didn't make sense, that that there was a certain kind of penal element being imposed upon them. So we're coming back and we're saying, look, we need to recognize the unique differences among the states. Now, what that does require, and in ACE, this is a little challenging. I'll be the first one to admit it. Because we're taking an incredibly different approach in how we are engaging with our co-state regulators, we have not put out a model rule. We have not issued a lot of guidance on ACE. And the reason being is that we want to keep ourselves flexible as states develop their plans for how to implement ACE. That is not how the EPA has traditionally operated, which is tough for the states because we are going into uncharted waters, hopefully arm in arm for the most part. But this also requires states to do a bit more work on the front end and on their own kind of side of the table, so that when they do bring their draft plans to us, or they want to ask us questions about, well, would you consider this or would you consider that, it requires more work on the state side on the front end. Now, it's going to require a lot of work on our side, on the back end, to make sure that we have some level of consistency across those state plans, but we do allow for the flexibility on a state-by-state basis. So that is driving some very interesting conversations. It's driving some very interesting ideas that are being brought to the fore for our consideration, quite frankly, for the first time. You have different states now because of grid considerations that are also talking to one another, and what those plans are going to look like between them. It's driving what I hope will be a much more collaborative and state-centric and region-centric approach, quite frankly, going forward, because I think that that's where you really get the greatest benefit. You get that greater level of engagement, and frankly, it's where you get the results. And you have to be freed up enough to do that and to allow for that to happen. And in the past, when EPA took a very strong, heavy-handed approach in terms of, well, here's what the goal is, and by the way, this is how you're going to get there, we're moving away from that. And that requires us all to do a little bit more work and to have a little bit of faith and trust in one another, and to work through some problems and some challenges and ideas that, either would be not brought to the table or would be dismissed because they weren't part of the way that, well, this is the way we've always done it. So it's changing the dynamic, but I think it's an important change to take place, and it's one to encourage and to drive.
Great, thank you. We'll be at the question and answer section part here soon. Moving towards that, Derek, I wanted to ask you, we've seen that polls show that Americans have a high trust of states existing to regulate for a clean environment. In kind of looking at the context of your work, how do you perceive in terms of responsiveness to the community and importance this balance between states and federal, and where you see maybe a better responsiveness to the needs of a particular community?
I would start by saying that a lot of the policies that are put forth in Washington, unfortunately, I would say when we start talking about climate and environment and energy and stuff, put forth by bi-coastal urban elitists. And they have no idea of what's taking place in these communities. They have no idea what's taking place in rural areas. I was actually invited to give witness testimony before the EPA, the House Natural Resources Committee on climate change, the need to act. My testimony focused on energy poverty and the millions of Americans who struggle each month to keep up with the rising cost of energy. But afterwards, I had follow-up questions from a lot of the congressmen. One of them came from Congressman Jody Heiss, 10th District from Georgia. And he said, Derek, you talked about energy poverty, how it exists around the country. And he said, and how these regulations that are being imposed would negatively impact low-income, minority, and rural communities. He said, I want to give you an example of how poor my constituents are. And he said, in Georgia, right now, people have to drive. There are parents who are driving to a Chick-fil-A so they can park in a parking lot to get Wi-Fi for their children to do their homework. Can you explain to us how these policies would impact these people if they were to go forward? And so I say all that to say, guys, again, what is being put forward in Washington, D.C. is not necessarily going to benefit what's happening in these communities, i.e. these rural communities here in Texas, in Georgia, and all across this country. So it would behoove everyone, these states, to get together and come up with policies that make sense that everybody can live with. And I hope I answered the question.
Thank you. Mike, real quick, looking at opposing views of EPA, energy policymaker, environmental regulator, each side makes their arguments. What do you think is correct?
Well, it goes back to what we started with, for those that weren't here when we started, just the whole constitutional framework of our country, okay? This is a statute, the Federal Clean Air Act in this example, where a compromise was made. Our members of Congress, through our great representative democracy, brokered a deal. They said the federal government, because of the interstate nature of pollution at the time in particular, right, is going to figure out a way to set the goalpost. And we are going to have these fundamental tenets of state-led cooperative federalism, the term was coined, right, to make sure that the states, for all the reasons Ann has mentioned and Derek just did as well, can fashion the remedies accordingly. And it worked when we stayed with that framework. 2 quick comments just to make it funny and interesting, because you just can't make this stuff up. A lot of the work I do is for rural electric cooperatives, so I totally get what Derek's saying. I mean, it is amazing how paternalistic the liberal elites can be, okay? Ann's predecessor in her job, and this is not a personal attack, because actually it was brilliant, right? They were engaged in this campaign, this PR campaign, to try to sell everybody how great the Clean Power Plan was. And she would, every place she would go, and she actually came, because Henry Cuellar was very upset about how it was going to impact South Texas cooperatives, she came to Texas to try to pat us on the head to convince us it was going to be all okay. By the way, she didn't stop to meet with EPA, or TCEQ, which is really odd for her to have done that, right, in Austin. Didn't stop to meet with our grid operator, just came to make sure that Congressman Cuellar's constituents got heard. Hey, we appreciated the opportunity. And these rural co-ops got in a room not very far from here, okay? And it was all about how this is a flexible rule. You guys can do whatever you want. And I think she thought we were all going to just shake our head and say, okay, that sounds right. But she misunderstood. These guys run electricity grids, okay? They're responsible and accountable, not just to ratepayers, but board members that sit around their table every month. I'm in those board meetings. It is hard to get away with anything if you're a rural cooperative staffer or an operator, because your customers are your managers, right? So those guys were so mad. I actually joked about how we should have had a sign out front that said, "Leave your guns here," just to scare her. But they were so mad that one of the general managers stood up and said, "Ma'am, first of all, they were as polite as they could be. They're Texans, they're South Texans. They appreciated her making the effort. But with all due respect, don't patronize us, okay? We're not your partners, we're your pawns." That's actually a line that Becky Keogh, head of the Arkansas DEQ, okay? This is not cooperative federalism, this is coercive federalism, another great term. And when we brought this lawsuit, 29 states brought suit. Some of those were Democratic states against the prior administration. So that told you right there that this was more about the proper balance, right? And maybe the best thing said about the lack of that balance in the prior rule that Ann just explained how they're correcting that fully was made in one of the actual Senate hearings on the Clean Power Plan, when Lawrence Tribe, not exactly a conservative, but he was just calling out the unconstitutional nature of this whole scam. And they said, the Democratic talking points were, but it's flexible. States get to do whatever they want to meet these, they acted like they were just setting the goalposts too. But the problem is, as Ann just said, what they did was they modeled exactly what it would take to force renewable energy on the market, get rid of all your fossil energy, and then they set that as your budget and said, go get it, okay? I don't know what the football metaphor of that was, but Larry Tribe said a great line, which was kind of hip for somebody as old as Larry is, and he was co-counsel in the case, so I think I can call him old, all right? Larry said this, he said, listen, when a robber says your money or your life, it's not flexible to say you can pay with cash, credit, or Bitcoin. Okay, and that's what the Clean Power Plan was. And so the correction is a really important one. Now there is a larger question, we may get into it in Q&A, about what is the long-term role of this agency when it comes to carbon dioxide. Okay, the Robb Center, many of my clients are trying to preserve the proper role to make sure that in the future this action to return the Clean Power Plan back to an EPA back to its lane with ACE doesn't somehow become a ticket to ride on other carbon-related things when they can't attribute that actual emission to a goal that is within their jurisdiction. A much stickier question, one that certainly is going to get resolved, hopefully, in a second term.
And closing with you before we go to question and answers, you mentioned in your opening remarks, this is the 50th anniversary of the Environmental Protection Agency. Give us some ideas in the overall track record, but specifically in the last couple of years of this administration, what is EPA looking at as it rolls to its first half century?
So we do really have a tremendous track record of success, and the sweeping changes that were made over the past 50 years, and a model that I think did a pretty bang-up job for the most part. I think what is going to happen over the next 50 years is I think we have to see the agency figure out how to work smarter, not harder. Figure out how to refocus its energy on those core priorities and missions that we have not won on all fronts. We don't have 100% safe drinking water for all Americans across the United States. Flint was a perfect example, and a very unfortunate and tragic example, quite frankly. And Flint happened because we took our eye off the ball and we were not focusing in on that core mission of providing and monitoring and regulating for safe drinking water. Prime example, we're doing that now. If we do nothing else, we cannot let another Flint, Michigan happen again. Same thing on the air front. Making sure that we're actually addressing real human health and environmental air challenges and concerns that are based on science, toxicology, epidemiological studies, and making sure that what we do going forward addresses those just very basic. And I can't call them simple because they become increasingly complex over the years. But if we don't do anything else, we have not lived up to our responsibilities. And unfortunately, over, I'd say, the more recent past, we've become distracted by some other issues that are not at the core of what EPA is supposed to be doing. It's all about human safety. It's all about protecting the environment and getting folks to that safe level and providing certainty from a regulatory standpoint to state, to industry, to communities, so that they know and they can be very confident when they leave their homes every day to go to school, to go to work, to play, to live, that they can be confident when they open up the tap, that when they take a big old breath of air, they're outside exercising or playing with their kids, that they're breathing safe air. There will continue to be, because we live in a very dynamic country with a very dynamic economy, things are constantly changing, we will continue to have environmental challenges, and they will continue to rise when it comes to my specific area, which is air and radiation. But we are so unbelievably blessed and uniquely equipped to rise to the challenge because of American ingenuity, American innovation, that we let our industry, we let the technology sector find solutions, and we encourage them to do so. And we don't pick winners and losers, and we don't say which one should win the day, and we don't say, well, we're really behind this type of energy more so than another. That needs to drive itself. That needs to be driven by by free markets. That needs to be driven by the latest and greatest information. We need to be in a position to allow for that because we have picked the low-hanging fruit, and we've done a very good job doing it. We're now looking at the middle and more so at the top of the canopy to get those incremental benefits that we need in certain areas. And really the best and most appropriate way to do that is to unleash that market innovation and that technology to identify the problem, make sure that we understand where it needs to be and how it needs to be addressed, and then allow Americans to figure out how do we close the gap. That's a great place to be. I mean, Mike alluded to other parts of the world that would kill to be in our shoes right now from an environmental and human health standpoint. This is the model upon which we should be exporting to the rest of the world, that we should be holding up and really touting and celebrating and shouting this from the rooftops. I mean, it's great news. It's a wonderful place to be. And we should not be getting in the way of that. And quite frankly, that is the private sector. That is, just American innovation. It's not driven by the federal government. We don't have a track record for that. And that's okay. We have a role and we're good at it, but we need to stay in that lane. We need to set the goalposts, and we need to let, private sector, American innovation figure out how to get us to that goal line and over it. And we're there and we can do it. And that's a wonderful place to be.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for y'all's remarks. We're going to move to questions. We'll have a microphone. Please wait to be recognized for the mic so we can catch that for the live feed. If you have a question, please raise your hand. But as the moderator's prerogative, I'll ask the first question in coming back a little bit tongue-in-cheek. And I think it's fair to say during the last administration, there weren't a whole lot of fans of the EPA in, let's say, Midland or the energy sector of Houston. Completely kidding here, but the EPA is what oil and gas operators would threaten their kids with if they wouldn't eat their vegetables at night. We've talked a lot about the role between the states and the federal government, though. Talk about the role between the industry, oil and gas, energy, and EPA, and to the extent that that relationship has been corrected and remedied under this administration in your tenure.
Sure. So when I first came on board as the Region 6 administrator and, really enjoyed the opportunity to, really dive into more of Texas, but then also the surrounding states, one of the things right out of the gate as I was making the rounds and in a very concerted effort, and we were directed to do this, which is please repair the damage that's been done to the relationships with the states and to industry. So one of the first meetings I had with a larger group was one of the oil and gas groups. And actually, I don't even think I was in Texas. I think I was in Arkansas or Louisiana. And At the end of my remarks during the Q&A section, this very nice gentleman raises his hand. He goes, "Ma'am, are you here to tell me that we're invited to your table? Because we felt for an awful long time like we were just on the menu." I said, "Sir, you've got a very good point." I said, "No one's on the menu anymore. Everyone's got a seat at the table. Industry, ENGOs, members of, small rural communities, big urban areas, does not matter to me. Everybody has a seat at this table. And this administration feels incredibly strongly that everybody deserves a seat at this table, and that is exactly what you will get." And that's what we do every day. The meetings you take, the places you go. No one is off limits to my office. I have an open door policy. I know Administrator Wheeler sure does. You should see his calendar. It's packed. And it's been really funny. You invite people to the table, and folks have been more than happy to take me up on that, which has been, wonderful to see. It's interesting, despite repeated efforts and invitations for ENGOs to, make themselves available to come to my office and to visit. I've only had a handful. So it's really good to see folks taking us up on that offer. I wish we had more engagement from ENGOs, because I do think that there are voices to be heard there. I don't necessarily think that it really helps in their efforts to show their names on the visitor logs at EPA these days. Trying to find productive solutions to the environmental challenges we're facing. It's a lot easier to throw bombs from afar and to criticize from afar than it is to actually sit down at the table and try to figure out how do we make the world better for Americans.
Great, thank you. Yes, sir.
Is this on?
Yep.
Okay. I appreciate your work, all three of you, and I'm curious what's being done at the EPA level relative to coal ash pollution and also fertilizer runoff that's creating the dead zone in the Gulf. I think those are more important, realistic concerns for us than CO2 emissions.
Sure, fair question. So that falls a little outside of my wheelhouse and outside of my lane, because CCR falls more so in the land management side, and the runoff issues from fertilizers are very much managed by the Office of Water. Now, that being said, you raise a very important point, and again, this is one of those core fundamental, what is EPA supposed to be focused on, and what are we supposed to be trying to solve? The dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is a big deal. How that impacts all of the watersheds and the rivers that ultimately bleed out into the Gulf of Mexico and take all of those different fertilizers, nitrates, nitrites, phosphorus along with it, and what that does along the way is a big deal. And it's something that is getting a lot of attention at EPA, at headquarters, and within those regions. I know Region 6, Region 7, which is based out of Kansas City, the regional administrator there, Jim Gulliford, is very involved in the hypoxia task force. Dave Ross, who heads up the Office of Water, this is a big issue for him. Same thing with the folks in Olem, which Peter Wright heads up. These are the types of things that really drive our efforts on a day-to-day basis. You don't hear about them as much because, they don't get the same level of media attention, but those are part of our ongoing day-to-day operations that really get to the crux of what our core responsibilities are, and that we're working every day and working very closely with the states to figure out, if you're dealing with, Corn Belt states, if you're, down coming through Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas, and everywhere in between, how do those different states and their water priorities and their water laws and their what's happening from an agricultural standpoint, how does that all come together? How can they work together? How can you drive the industry towards finding better, smarter ways to actually tackling that problem? Because it's regional, it's state by state, and then it gets into the federal water. So this is a multi-headed, challenging issue that deserves a lot of time and attention, and we're giving it just that.
I'll comment quickly. So, the good news, so in ANSHOP, it's protection of airsheds, right? So there's interrelationship among states, and so that's what makes it technically tricky, and they've done a great job, and we've seen great results. Water, we have the similar tools, right? So there is what's called watershed tools within the Water Act and the state corresponding acts, and TMDL's total maximum daily load modeling helps protect that. I can assure you of two things, and I'll be meeting with Peter on Tuesday about coal ash. Is there is no watershed in the United States that's impaired because of the constituents that you actually find in coal ash. Coal ash is a serious issue because it is literally the largest quantity waste product when it's actually wasted. Now, it's also 60% recycled, and every highway in Texas has it. So it's a classic example. If you mismanage it, it could be a problem. You find innovation and markets for it, it can be a great product, right? So the prior administration used coal ash, frankly, to do very similar things as the Clean Power Plan did. It was trying to say coal can't possibly be used safely, so let's just make it so impossible that they can never satisfy it. What this administration has done is said, hey, we're not backing off. We are going to make sure that if you're impounding coal ash at a plant, you're going to have liners, you're going to have groundwater protection, and all of those things have happened. And we've seen some retirement of some of our older units because they can't meet the standard or it doesn't make economic sense to do it. But what I've seen, and I do a lot of work in the power sector, is a great set of innovation, a dual strategy of let's make sure we have all the protective mechanisms so that the lined facilities that have all the protections in place can continue to be low-cost sources of energy. Let's shut down the old ones that don't have those protections. And let's also make sure that that material, which can be extremely valuable, gets recycled as much as possible. I mean, I'm proud to say Kathleen had a lot to do with this too when she was at the commission. Texas, is the leader. Literally, during the Clinton administration, Texas was held up as the model for recycling of coal ash. Steel slag too, in case you were wondering. But so we use innovation in Texas. We turn waste into product, and that is, along with other tools, some of the best environmental protection we do in America, and particularly here in Texas.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hey, Derek, Jason Isaac with the Life Powered Project at TPPF. You wrote an op-ed last year about the NAACP, which ironically has the word advancement in their name, how the fossil fuel industry manipulates communities of color. And there's a huge lawsuit in California from it's called the 200, which is 200 civil rights groups that are suing the state of California for civil rights violations. Can you tell us how some of these policies, maybe not so much the ACE rule, but state policies that are being proposed and passed around the country affect communities of color?
Well, that particular one in California has to do with housing. And when you start talking about housing, you also have to talk about energy. And so it's trying to find affordable housing that's impacting these people. And then in addition to the affordable housing, they're having to deal with the rising cost of energy out there in California. And so a lot of times, to answer your question, it goes back to what I said earlier. When you implement these renewable policies, we did several events, and we actually had people bring in their electric bill. And people would bring in their electric bill, and they'd be like, what is this for? Why am I paying this right here? And I said, those are the subsidies. That's what you're being charged for all these renewables. And they're saying, well, how do we get rid of them? And I'm like, well, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, because that's not what I'm here for. But certainly you should take a look at who your elected officials are, what their stance is on energy, and that's who you need to take a look at when it comes time to go to the polls in November. And so once you start getting that kind of information out to people, I think it can make a difference in us moving the needle, because all we need is a few to get the job done in November. We just need a few. And so we get this information out, and we start talking to them about these regulations and the harmful impacts it has on them every single day and in their communities, and it makes a difference.
What a great point to end on. Please help me in thanking our panel here today.